what a wonderful world.
One of the most famous songs ever recorded was rejected by the very label that owned it. The executive who heard it decided it was worthless and refused to promote it. The artist had no say. The contract was clear. The record simply sat on a shelf. And then, years later, it played in a movie. Then another. Then it was in a department store. Then a television advertisement. Then a funeral. Then a wedding. By the time the label finally admitted what it had, the man who made the recording was already gone. That song is What a Wonderful World. And the executive who buried it was not some minor gatekeeper. He was the president of the record company. This is not a story about one song. Between 1954 and 1979, record labels operated as the absolute gatekeepers of popular music. There was no internet, there was no streaming, there was no way for a song to reach millions of people unless a label pressed it, a radio station played it, and a television program promoted it. That concentration of power meant that the instincts, preferences, and fears of a relatively small number of executives could determine which music the public ever heard at all. And those executives were frequently wrong. What makes the following stories remarkable is not that interference happened. What makes them remarkable is how the record survived anyway.
Well, that'll be the day when you say goodbye.
In 1956, Buddy Holly walked into a Decca record studio and recorded That'll Be the Day. Decca heard it and declined to release it. They dropped Holly from the roster entirely and shelved the session. Under the terms of his contract, Holly was legally prohibited from re-recording the same songs for any competing label for 5 years. Most artists in that position had no options. Holly found one. He signed with Coral Records and Brunswick Records, both of which were subsidiaries of Decca. Technically, he was still on the Decca family. Practically, he was with a different imprint, under a different name, the Crickets. In 1957, that version of That'll Be the Day was released. It reached #1. The original label had the session on tape. They had chosen not to use it. The only reason the song exists in the form the world knows it is because a young artist and his management found a legal loophole inside the corporate structure of the company that had already rejected him. When the Kingsmen recorded Louie in 1963, the session took about 2 hours. The result was a murky, distorted recording with vocals that were difficult to decipher. That indecipherability became its problem. Rumors spread that the lyrics, heard at the right speed or angle, contained obscene content. The governor of Indiana personally called for the song to be banned in his state. Radio stations across the country pulled it from rotation, and the FBI opened a formal investigation. For 31 months, federal agents analyzed the recording at multiple speeds. They consulted lip readers, they requested transcripts, they built a case file. At the end of 31 months, the Bureau concluded that the lyrics were, in their words, unintelligible at any speed, and that no obscenity could be confirmed. The record had already sold millions of copies. The Kingsmen's label had to manage federal scrutiny of what would become one of the most covered songs in rock and roll history, one that now appears in film soundtracks, at sporting events, and at high school dances in every decade since. In 1960, Ray Peterson recorded Tell Laura I Love Her, a song about a young man who dies in a car crash while trying to win prize money for his girlfriend. In the United States, some stations refused to play it. They called it a death disc. They said it glamorized tragedy. The song still climbed into the American top 10, despite the resistance. In the United Kingdom, the reaction was somewhat different. Decca Records reviewed the track, decided it was in bad taste, and ordered thousands of already pressed copies destroyed. Not shelved, not withheld, destroyed. A rival label moved quickly and recorded a cover version with a British artist named Ricky Valance. That version was released, received airplay on stations that had no copies of the Peterson record to play, and reached #1 in the UK. Peterson's version, the original, never charted in Britain, The label's decision to pulp the pressing created a commercial vacuum, and a competitor filled it. What is documented here is not simply a ban. It is a label that physically destroyed its own product and handed a #1 hit to a rival as a consequence. By 1967, the Rolling Stones had been established for 4 years. Let's Spend the Night Together was their current single. The Ed Sullivan Show was one of the most important promotional platforms available to any artist in America. An appearance could move tens of thousands of units. Labels and management understood this, and artists routinely made accommodations to secure the slot. Sullivan's producers required the Stones to change the lyric. Let's Spend the Night Together was to become Let's Spend Some Time Together. Mick Jagger agreed, performed the edited version, and reportedly rolled his eyes on camera during that specific line. Beyond the Sullivan incident, conservative stations in the United States refused to play the song in its original form at all. This created a situation where the label was promoting a record that did not exist in its original version in significant portions of its target market. What happens when a label suppresses a song not because of its content, but because an executive simply does not believe in it? What happens when the interference is not ideological, but commercial, and the record survives anyway? In 1968, Marvin Gaye recorded I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Motown had already released a version of the same song by Gladys Knight and the Pips, which had performed well on the charts. Berry Gordy, who ran Motown, reportedly resisted releasing Gaye's version as a single. The label had already worked that song. There was no obvious commercial logic in going back to it. Gaye's version was placed on an album. Radio DJs found it. They began spinning it on their own, without a promotional push, without the label's support. Listener response built. Demand accumulated at stations. Motown relented and issued it as a single. It became one of the best-selling singles in Motown's history to that point. It reached #1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. The label had not identified this. The audience had. The label had to be led to its own hit by the people who were already playing it.
What a wonderful world.
Louie Armstrong recorded What a Wonderful World in 1967. Larry Newton, the president of ABC Records, disliked the song. He did not merely decline to prioritize it, he refused to promote it in the United States at all. The song was released in the UK. It reached #1 there. It became a substantial hit across Europe and in several other markets. In the United States, where Armstrong was from, where his career had been built, the record barely registered. The president of his label had decided it had no commercial value, and without promotional support, it had none. Armstrong died in 1971. At the time of his death, What a Wonderful World had not achieved in America what it had achieved everywhere else. Then it appeared in a film, then another. The song accumulated a cultural weight that no executive decision could ultimately prevent. By the 1980s, it was among the most recognizable recordings in American popular music. Lloyd Price's Stagger Lee is based on a documented historical event, a shooting in St. Louis in 1895 that passed into American folk tradition over the following decades. By the time Price recorded it in 1959, the song was already embedded in the culture. The recorded version retained the violence and the gambling that gave the story its weight. To appear on American Bandstand, the most watched music television program in the country, Price was required to re-record the song with sanitized lyrics. References to the shooting were softened, the gambling context was removed. A Baudelarized version was performed for the cameras. This was not the label's preference. It was a condition imposed by television, which the label then enforced on the artist, because the appearance was worth more to the label's commercial interests than the integrity of the lyric. The cleaned version aired. The original version continued to circulate. What the episode documents is a specific mechanism of the era. Television gatekeepers functioning as a secondary layer of censorship, with labels positioned between the artist and the camera, pushing the artist toward compliance.
Lola.
In 1970, the Kinks released Lola. It was a strong record. The BBC was set to play it. Then someone at the BBC noticed that the lyric contained the brand name Coca-Cola. The BBC's charter prohibited the broadcast of material that could constitute free advertising for commercial products. Coca-Cola was, unambiguously, a commercial product. The rule was clear. The label and the band had a choice: leave the lyric as it was and lose BBC airplay, which would significantly limit the song's reach in Britain, or change it. Ray Davies flew from the United States, where the Kinks were on tour, back to London. He went into a studio and re-recorded a single line, changing Coca-Cola to Cherry Cola. The corrected version was cleared for broadcast. Davies then flew back to the United States to resume the tour. The song became a hit on both sides of the Atlantic. It is now understood as a landmark of the era. The flight was made, the word was changed, and the record was saved. But the sequence of events is worth holding for a moment. A song that has endured for more than 50 years was nearly blocked from its primary promotional platform because of a carbonated beverage brand name.
Why can't we live together?
In 1972, Timmy Thomas recorded "Why Can't We Live Together" in a single session. The instrumentation was minimal: an organ, a drum machine, and his voice. There was nothing else. The producer, Steve Alimo, looked at what he had and reportedly considered rebuilding it, adding musicians, filling out the sound, making it more commercially presentable in the way that labels and producers understood commercial to mean. He decided instead to release what he had recorded. The track's starkness became its most identifiable quality. There was no place for the ear to hide. The drum machine's simplicity and the organ's weight pushed the lyric forward with an urgency that a full production might have diluted. It became a hit. It has since been sampled extensively and remains in active circulation decades later. The pattern across 3 decades is not primarily a story of censorship. It is a story of an industry systematically underestimating the audience's capacity to respond to something unfamiliar. The executives were not bad people. They were operating logically within a model that was correct most of the time and badly wrong at the moments that mattered most. Wake Up Little Susie was banned in Boston in 1957. The assumption was that the teenage couple in the lyric had done more than fall asleep at the movie. The song was deemed indecent. The ban was regional. It affected certain markets and not others. In cities where the ban held, the song did not play on mainstream radio. What this created across the country was a fragmented experience of the same record. Someone in Boston in 1957 had a different relationship to Wake Up Little Susie than someone in Chicago or Los Angeles. The song existed, but unevenly in pockets, in the spaces between radio markets.
Great balls of fire, kiss me, baby.
Great Balls of Fire was refused by Southern stations in 1957 on the grounds that Lewis's delivery and the religious language in the lyric were, in combination, blasphemous. The accusation had a specific logic. Lewis was a Pentecostal-raised artist who was conflicted about the music he was making. The tension in his public statements about the song, about whether what he was doing was sanctioned or sinful, was real and documented. The stations that refused to play it were not simply performing censorship. They were responding to an actual ambiguity in the record's content. The song charted regardless. The Southern ban meant it charted differently there than elsewhere. Lewis's subsequent collapse in public standing, following revelations about his personal life, was a separate matter. But the early resistance to Great Balls of Fire captures something specific. The period in which rock and roll was not yet established as a category, when its relationship to existing cultural forms, gospel, blues, country, was still being negotiated in real time by stations, audiences, and artists simultaneously. Work With Me, Annie, recorded by Hank Ballard and the Midnighters in 1954, was explicit enough by the standards of the time that the FCC urged broadcasters to refuse airplay. NBC, and affiliated stations declined to carry it. The mainstream radio ecosystem was effectively closed. What happened next was not silence. The record sold. It sold through independent record shops, through word of mouth, through the informal economy that existed around music the mainstream refused to acknowledge. It became a major R&B hit without the support of the infrastructure that was supposed to produce hits. The lesson was absorbed by certain labels and producers who were paying attention. A ban, in the right circumstances, was not death. It was advertisement. It confirmed for a specific audience that the record existed and that the establishment did not want them to have it. Emma by Hot Chocolate was almost not released in 1974. The band and their team considered the song too slow, too morbid, too unlikely to find an audience on the singles market. It had a dark narrative, a deliberate tempo, and a structure that did not follow the obvious commercial template of the period. They released it anyway. It reached number 8 on the American Top 40. It became one of the most remembered songs in the band's catalog. Listeners who heard it in 1974 or 1975 still identify it immediately. The Hot Chocolate story is quieter than some of the others on this list. There was no FBI investigation, no destroyed pressing, no transatlantic flight. There was simply a moment of institutional hesitation, a near miss between the record being made and the record not existing. That near miss is common to almost every entry here. In most of these cases, the distance between the song surviving and the song disappearing was not a matter of years or major battles. It was a conversation, a decision, a meeting that went one way instead of another. Joe Meek produced Have I the Right by the Honeycombs in 1964. He took it to multiple major labels. All of them passed. The production was unusual. The sound Meek was working with was not standard. The track had a driven, insistent quality that did not obviously fit the format of what major labels were pressing at the time. Pi Records took it. It reached number 1 in the United Kingdom. It sold over 1 million copies worldwide before the end of 1964. Every label that had passed on it watched it chart. The Honeycombs story is notable for what it documents about the A&R function, the people whose specific job was to identify commercially viable music operating with full professional responsibility, looked at a future number 1 single and declined it. Across 3 decades from the mid-1950s through the late 1970s, this pattern repeated often enough to reveal something deeper about the music industry itself. Record labels feared controversy and moral panic. They misjudged songs that were too slow, too sparse, too strange, or simply too different from what had worked before. They destroyed pressings, shelved recordings, and refused to promote records that would later define the very decades in which they were made. And yet, the songs found their way out. Sometimes through simple chance, as with Buddy Holly. Sometimes through a radio DJ spinning an album cut without permission, as happened with Marvin Gaye. Sometimes because a producer trusted what he heard in the studio, like Timmy Thomas. And sometimes because a smaller label took the risk that every major company had already passed on, as happened with the Honeycombs and Joe Meek. None of these were carefully designed outcomes. They were the result of persistence, luck, and the occasional refusal to accept that a record should remain unheard. The music survived. The reasoning that tried to bury it did not. And today, those songs continue to play on radios, in films, and in playlists. More than half a century after someone decided they weren't worth hearing. If you enjoyed this look back at the songs that almost disappeared, let me know in the comments which one surprised you the most. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.